Helen Hawthorne slammed her hand flat on the sheriff's desk so hard that the inkwell rattled, and the stack of wanted posters slid sideways onto the floor. And she did not pick them up, and she did not apologize, and the look in her brown eyes dared the man behind the desk to say a single word about either of those things. "You are telling me," she said, her voice pitched low and dangerously controlled, "that you knew Frank Cutter was buying up water rights under false names. You knew he was threatening families off their land, and you have done absolutely nothing for 6 months." Sheriff Silas Hayes leaned back in his chair. The chair creaked. He let it creak twice more on purpose, slow and deliberate, while he looked at her from beneath the brim of a hat he had not bothered to remove, and the cool gray of his eyes did not flicker with guilt the way she wanted them to. "I know a great many things," he said. "Knowing things and proving things are different occupations. That is a coward's answer. That is a lawman's answer. You are hiding behind procedure while Cutter drives the Mercer family off land their father broke his back clearing. While he poisons wells, while he bribes your deputy. You know about the deputy too, do not pretend you do not." And there it was, the trap. She had laid it cleanly, and she watched his jaw shift, watched the slight tightening around his eyes that told her she had hit something real, something he had not expected her to know. Silas Hayes set both hands flat on the desk and said, very quietly, "Who exactly are you, Miss Hawthorne?" "I warned you," she said, equally quiet, "before I sat down in that chair that I argue about everything. You said you had been bored for years. I am telling you right now that your boredom is finished." He stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted behind those gray eyes, something she could not yet name, and she was not sure she wanted to name it. Not yet. Not while Frank Cutter still owned half of Caldwell Creek and her sister's family was sleeping in a barn. But the shift was there. She had seen it. And Helen Hawthorne had learned in her 28 years on this earth that the moment a man's boredom ended was either the most dangerous moment in the world or the most useful one. She intended to make it useful. She had arrived in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1882, stepping off the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway into a town that smelled of cattle dust and early autumn, and something sour underneath both of those things that she could not immediately identify. She had one trunk, one carpetbag, a letter from her younger sister Clara folded 4 times in her coat pocket, and a legal pad on which she had been making notes since Topeka. Clara's letter had been short, which was how Clara wrote when she was frightened. She and her husband Thomas had built up 40 acres of good grazing land along Bluff Creek, 5 miles east of town. A man named Frank Cutter had been buying up adjacent land for 2 years, filing claims in various names at the county seat, and in the past 4 months, he had started pressuring the smaller ranchers directly. Thomas had found 2 of his horses shot. A neighbor named Abel Mercer had been told by a man with no name that the price of staying on his land had just gone up to something he could not pay. And when Clara had gone to the sheriff, she had been told, politely, that there was nothing that could be done without evidence. Helen had read that letter on the train and written 4 pages of notes before the conductor came through to announce their approach to Caldwell Creek. She was a schoolteacher by trade and by genuine inclination. She had taught in Wichita for 3 years and before that in Lawrence, and she had a reputation in both places for being, as one school board chairman had put it, relentlessly precise and stubbornly thorough. He had meant it as a criticism. Helen had thanked him genuinely and asked for the criticism in writing so she could keep it. She was not a lawyer. She was not a detective. She had no official standing in anything regarding Frank Cutter or water rights or the corruption of a deputy sheriff in a small Kansas cattle town. What she had was an understanding of documents, a complete absence of fear around men who expected women to be afraid of them, and a sister whose children had been eating salted pork and cornmeal for 6 weeks because their father could not take his cattle to market without crossing land that Cutter now controlled. She had also, before leaving Wichita, gone to the county registrar's office and spent 2 days reading property records, water rights filings, tax documents, and the incorporation papers of 6 separate land companies, 3 of which shared a lawyer and 2 of which shared a post office box address in a town where no one by those names had ever lived. When she sat down across from Sheriff Hayes, she already knew more about Frank Cutter's hidden network of false ownership than the man himself probably thought anyone outside of his own circle knew. What she did not know was whether the sheriff was part of that circle. She had walked into his office ready to find out, and the way he had reacted to her mention of the deputy had told her clearly. He was not corrupt. He was something else. He was a man who had made peace with a situation he could not change, and in doing so had settled into a kind of cold stillness that looked like indifference but was not quite indifference, because a man who was truly indifferent did not tighten his jaw when someone pointed at the thing he had been refusing to look at. So she had said what she said about his boredom, and she had watched him look at her like she was something he had not expected the world to produce, and she had thought, good. Unexpected is exactly what this situation requires. Sit down, he said, and she realized she had stood up during the confrontation without noticing it. She sat. Tell me everything you have, he said. I will tell you a portion of it, she said, when I know whether you are useful. For the second time he stared at her in a way that was not quite hostility and not quite admiration, and occupied some space between the two that she found, despite herself, unexpectedly interesting. You came here not knowing whether I was involved, he said. I came here having made a fairly confident assessment that you were not directly involved. I did not, however, rule out the possibility of passive complicity, and I will not rule it out until I know more about you. That is a very careful way of calling a man a coward to his face. I called you a coward 10 minutes ago without any care at all, she said. What I am doing now is more precise than that. Silas Hayes removed his hat and set it on the desk beside the fallen inkwell, and Helen saw for the first time the full line of his face, which was sun-bronzed and angular, and wore about 10 years of something she would come to understand later as a particular kind of grief. He was perhaps 35, perhaps a year or 2 on either side. His dark hair had a single streak of gray above his left temple that he had clearly given up trying to conceal. He had a scar along his jaw that had healed cleanly and was therefore old. My name is Silas Hayes, he said. I have been the sheriff of Caldwell Creek for 4 years. Before that, I was a United States Marshal working out of Dodge City, and before that I spent 7 years as a deputy under Marshal Bill Tilghman, and was present at enough moments in the history of this territory that I am not a man who frightens easily, and I am not a man who lacks nerve. He paused. I am a man who has, for reasons I will explain when they become relevant, chosen not to move against Frank Cutter yet. The word yet is doing significant work in that sentence. Helen folded her hands on the desk. Why yet? Because Cutter is not the problem. Cutter is the symptom. There is a man behind Cutter, a man with political connections that reach to Topeka and possibly further, and if I move against Cutter without the full architecture of proof, that man will have Cutter's operation transferred, the charges dissolved, and me removed from office within 60 days. I have seen him do exactly that to 2 other law enforcement officers in this state. Helen was quiet for a moment. This was new information. This changed the shape of the document trail she had been building. Who is the man behind Cutter? She asked. His name is Aldous Pemberton, Silas said. He is a land speculator and a state-level political donor, and he has a perfectly clean public record because every single dirty transaction he has ever made has been conducted through layers of men like Cutter who can be cut loose when necessary. Helen opened her carpetbag and produced her legal pad. Pemberton, she said, writing the name. Pemberton. Silas watched her write it. What are you doing? I am updating my notes. When did Pemberton first appear in connection with Kansas land speculation? He told her. She wrote. He told her more, and she wrote more. And somewhere in the middle of that exchange, the confrontation became a conversation. And somewhere in the middle of the conversation, something peculiar happened, which was that Silas Hayes, who had not had a conversation that required his full attention in approximately 3 years, found himself leaning forward across the desk and talking faster than he had talked in longer than he could easily calculate, because the woman across from him was not nodding politely. She was pushing back. She was asking the question underneath the answer he had just given. She was pointing at the gap he had glossed over and refusing to let him gloss over it. "You said the water rights filings were done through a company called Blue Rock Land Associates," she said, "but the Blue Rock name only appears in records starting in April of this year. What was the previous company name?" "Frontier Holdings. And Frontier Holdings was dissolved in March." "Yes." "Why March? What happened in February that made dissolution necessary?" He stopped. He actually stopped and looked at her with an expression she would later recognize as the one he wore when he was recalibrating his understanding of a situation. "A land commissioner named Harold Voss died in February," he said slowly. "He died of a fever officially. But unofficially." Unofficially, Voss had been making noise about irregularities in the filings. He was found dead of a fever 3 days after he wrote a letter to the state land office. Helen wrote the name Voss and underlined it twice. "Where is that letter?" "It went to the state land office and was presumably buried." "I need a copy of that letter." "It is a state document in a Topeka office that is almost certainly controlled by people friendly to Pemberton." "I have a former colleague in Topeka who is a records clerk," Helen said without looking up from her pad. "She owes me a favor from an incident involving a school board dispute in 1879 that I will not detail, but that she has not forgotten. I will write to her tonight." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, as if the words needed to be handled with a certain amount of respect, "Miss Hawthorne, I have been building a case against Pemberton for 14 months, and I am approximately here." He held his thumb and forefinger an inch apart. "You have been in this town for less than 2 hours, and you have just given me a thread I did not have." She looked up then, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment that went on just slightly longer than was strictly professional. "My sister's family is sleeping in a barn," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I am sorry for it." "Being sorry for it from a distance is not useful. I know that too." She closed her legal pad and put it back in the carpetbag. "I will be staying at the Caldwell House Hotel. I intend to take a position at the schoolhouse if there is one available, because I need a reason to be in this town that does not make Cutter nervous before we are ready to move." "There is a school," he said. "The teacher left in July. The town council has been placing notices. Then I will call on them tomorrow morning." She stood. "I expect to speak with you again before the week is out. I also expect that you will, in the meantime, tell me everything you know about the deputy. His name is Roy Dabbs. He has been on Cutter's payroll for approximately 8 months. I have been allowing him to remain in place because a deputy who reports to Cutter tells me when Cutter is moving." "That is clever," she said, and the word was not sarcastic, which surprised him more than the sarcasm would have. "Thank you," he said, and that was not sarcastic either, which surprised her a little too. She left. He sat in the silence she left behind, and he picked up the inkwell and righted it, and he looked at the door for a while, and then he pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote the name Harold Voss at the top, and stared at it with the particular focused look of a man who has just discovered that a locked door he has been circling for a year might have a different key than the one he has been trying. Helen had not been wrong about the schoolhouse position. The Caldwell Creek Town Council, composed of 4 men who ranged from mildly self-important to genuinely well-meaning, received her the following morning in the back room of the general store, which doubled as their meeting space, and hired her within 25 minutes. She had her certificates, her references from Wichita, and an ability to make the interview feel like the most natural and inevitable conversation in the world, which was a skill she had developed as a defense mechanism against school boards that wanted to interrogate her personal life more than her teaching qualifications. She also had, within those 25 minutes, learned 3 things about Frank Cutter's local standing that she had not known before, simply by listening carefully to the way the council members talked around certain subjects. 2 of the council members were afraid of Cutter. One of them, a dry goods merchant named Everett Price, was not afraid but was something more complicated, which was aware of Cutter's activities and passively benefiting from the increased land values that came from smaller ranchers being pushed out. And one of them, a weathered old cattle rancher named George Aldridge, was quietly, bitterly furious about what was happening to his neighbors and had not been able to do anything about it because he was 71 years old with bad knees and a wife who needed him alive. She made note of Everett Price and George Aldridge in separate columns. The school was a single-room building at the north end of Main Street with 14 students between the ages of 6 and 15, a wood stove, 3 dozen primers in varying states of decay, and a blackboard that had been cleaned imperfectly and still bore the ghost of a previous arithmetic lesson. Helen stood in it alone for half an hour before the students arrived, walking the rows of desks, and felt the particular settling of herself that always came when she was in a schoolroom, the sense of being in the right-shaped space for the kind of person she was. She would make this work. She would teach these children, genuinely and well, because that was who she was, and she would also, in the hours that school teaching did not require, dismantle the hidden architecture of Frank Cutter and Aldous Pemberton piece by piece. She saw Silas Hayes again on Thursday. He came to the school at the end of the day when the last child had gone home and knocked on the open door with his hat in his hand, and for a moment he looked so different from the flat-voiced, immovable man behind the desk that she almost didn't recognize him, except that the gray eyes were the same and the scar along his jaw was the same. "I have news," he said. "Come in," she said. She was at the blackboard erasing the day's geography lesson. She did not stop erasing it. He came in and stood in the aisle between the desks with his hat in both hands, turning it slightly the way men did when they were working out how to start something. "Roy Dabbs reported to Cutter's ranch yesterday. I had a man watching. They met for 20 minutes and then Dabbs came back to town and made a deposit at the bank. I now have the amount and the timing documented." Helen set down the eraser. "That establishes a pattern of payment." "It does, but it is not enough on its own without connecting it to specific actions Dabbs took in exchange. I need to catch him actively suppressing evidence or filing a false report." "What is Cutter's next move likely to be?" "He wants the Mercer land. Abel Mercer has refused to sell twice." Cutter's pattern in the 2 previous cases was to escalate to legal pressure at this point, to file some kind of claim against the property, anything to muddy the title and make the land legally unusable until Mercer either sells or goes bankrupt fighting it. Helen had been thinking about Abel Mercer since Clara's letter. "Is there anything wrong with Mercer's title? Not that I have found." "Has Mercer kept all his tax records?" Silas paused. "I do not know." "Find out," she said. "If Cutter is going to file a false claim, he will look for the weakest point in the documentation. If Mercer has any gaps in his tax records, anything missing or filed late, that is where the attack will come." She watched him make a mental note the way she recognized people doing it, a slight internal shift, a reorganization. "You think like an attorney," he said. "I think like someone who has spent years getting school boards to do things they do not want to do, which is essentially the same skill set." He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, and she noticed it the way you notice the first moment a sky shifts before a change in weather. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I am going to ask you to receive it in the spirit it is intended, which is a professional spirit and not a personal one." "Say it." "Cutter knows you are here. Not your full purpose, but he knows a woman arrived from Wichita and went directly to my office and spent 2 hours there. He will be watching you." Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How does he know? Caldwell Creek is not a large town." "No, how specifically does he know about the visit to your office?" "Someone told him." Silas met her eyes steadily. Everett Price on the town council is friendly with Cutter's foreman. She thought of Price's face during the council meeting, the way he had talked about increased land values with just a shade too much comfort. "Yes," she said. "I had noted that." She picked up the eraser again and finished cleaning the blackboard. "What do you suggest?" "I suggest that you are careful about what you discuss and with whom. I also suggest that if Cutter or any of his men approach you directly, you come to me immediately, and not argue with them myself. I have a feeling arguing with them yourself would not be the issue. The issue would be that arguing with them yourself would tell them you know more than a schoolteacher newly arrived in town should know." That was a fair point, and she acknowledged it with a nod. "I will be careful," she said. "I will also, tonight, write that letter to my contact in Topeka about the Voss correspondence." "I want to read it before you send it," he said. "Not to change it. To understand what you are asking for." "Why?" "Because if it goes wrong and the letter is traced back to you, I need to be able to contain the damage quickly." She turned from the blackboard and looked at him with a direct appraisal that he was learning to recognize as her version of deciding something. "Come to the hotel at 7 this evening," she said. "I will have a draft." He was there at 7, sitting in the small parlor of the Caldwell House Hotel with a cup of coffee that he held without drinking, while Helen sat across from him with her draft letter on the table between them. He read it carefully. She watched him read it, noting the way his eyes moved across the page, steady and thorough, missing nothing. "This is good," he said. "This is very good. You are asking for a copy of the Voss letter without directly stating why, which means if someone reads this correspondence they cannot immediately understand its significance. That was intentional. I know." He set the letter down. "I want to tell you about Aldous Pemberton." She poured herself more coffee. The parlor was empty except for them, the other guests having gone to dinner or to their rooms, and there was a fire in the small iron stove in the corner and a lamp on the table between them. And the evening had the quality that sometimes came in autumn in Kansas, where the warmth inside and the cooling outside created a kind of sealed-in stillness. Silas told her about Aldous Pemberton. He had been building the story in pieces for 14 months, and now he told it all in sequence. And Helen listened without interrupting, except when she needed to, which was 3 times. Pemberton had begun acquiring Kansas land interests in 1878. He had been present in Topeka during the period when the cattle trade from Texas was shifting north, when the question of which Kansas towns would prosper and which would fade was still open, and he had understood before most people that the answer was tied to water. Whoever controlled the water sources along the great cattle routes controlled the land, and whoever controlled the land controlled everything else. He had begun with entirely legal purchases. Then, as legal land became expensive, he had developed the network of false companies and proxy buyers. Cutter was his most effective local operator, a man with no hesitation and no conscience and a genuine talent for low-level intimidation that stopped just short of anything that would bring serious legal attention. Harold Voss had been a state land commissioner who had noticed the pattern of Blue Rock and its predecessor companies in February. He had written a letter. He had been dead within a week, officially fever. Silas did not believe fever. "Can you prove it wasn't fever?" Helen asked. "No. He was buried before I was notified, and I have no jurisdiction over a state official's death in any case. His family, a wife in Topeka, a son who works for a railroad in Colorado." Helen wrote both down. "I'm not suggesting we exhume the man," she said, "but a letter from his wife saying that he was healthy until the week of his death, that he had expressed fear or concern in the days before he died, that sort of thing is something that could be submitted as corroborating context in a legal proceeding." Silas stared at her. "You are thinking about trial preparation." "I have been thinking about trial preparation since I got off the train." He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully read, something complex and quiet and not quite what she was expecting, and she made herself focus on her legal pad because the expression was the kind that required attention she did not have available for it at this point in the project. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. "Helen," she said, and surprised herself. A pause. "Helen," he said, and his voice doing something slightly different with that word than it did with most words, something she absolutely noticed and chose to set aside. "I am going to ask you to understand something about the position I am in. All right. I have been in this town for 4 years. Before this town, I spent 7 years in federal service, and before that I was in this territory before it was properly settled, and I have seen things that settled into a person and changed the shape of certain things. The reason I have moved carefully against Pemberton is not cowardice." He stopped. "I know," she said quietly. "Do you?" "Yes. You are a man who has been burned before by moving too fast against someone connected enough to have the charges reversed. You are protecting the case by being methodical." "Yes, but there is also—" He stopped again. This stopping was different. This was a man reaching for something harder to say. "There is also something that has made you reluctant," she said carefully. "Something beyond strategy." The fire settled in the stove. Outside, someone walked past the hotel on the wooden sidewalk, their boots loud and then fading. "My deputy before Roy Dabbs," Silas said. His name was James Corey. He was 24 years old and he was good at the job, and he had a wife who was expecting their first child. He found evidence against Cutter last year. A real piece of it, an actual forged document. Before I could move on it, Cutter found out. James Corey and his wife left Caldwell Creek for Dodge City very suddenly, and I have received one letter from him since which said only that they were well and that he was sorry. He paused. "I do not know whether they were threatened or paid. I believe threatened. I have never been able to ask him directly." Helen was quiet for a long moment. "You feel responsible." "I was the one who put him in the position." "He was your deputy. It was his position." "He was 24 and he had a pregnant wife, and I was the experienced man, and I should have protected the information better. You have been carrying that since last year." "I have been carrying it since last year." She looked at him, at the set of his jaw and the steadiness in his eyes that was steadiness over something that was not quite as steady underneath, and she thought, "This is why the boredom. Not because there was nothing to do, because doing things had consequences, and the consequences had shaped themselves into a kind of paralysis dressed up as patience." "James Corey's wife and child are presumably alive and safe," she said. "That is worth something. Not as much as it would be worth if Cutter were in a jail cell." "No," she agreed, "but it means you did not fail entirely. You just failed at the part that was beyond your control." She paused. "That distinction matters." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was several things at once, and then he said, "You are a very unusual woman, Helen Hawthorne." "I have been told that," she said, "usually by people who mean it less as a compliment." "I mean it as a compliment." Something shifted in the air between them, something small but clear, and Helen moved her attention firmly back to the legal pad. "Tomorrow," she said, "I need you to find out the state of Abel Mercer's tax records. And I want to visit my sister." "I will ride out with you," he said. "I have been meaning to speak with Thomas Hawthorne about the horses." She looked up. "Thomas's name is Mercer. Clara married Thomas Mercer." He shook his head. "Your sister is Clara Mercer. Abel Mercer is her father-in-law." Helen stopped. She had not known that. She had not known that the Mercer whose land was being targeted was the father of her sister's husband, which meant the pressure on the Mercers was direct family pressure on Clara, which meant this was significantly more complicated than she had understood from the letter. "Clara did not tell me that," she said. "Clara Mercer may not have wanted to alarm you more than necessary." "Clara," Helen said, with the particular restraint of a woman who loved her sister very much and was simultaneously very frustrated with her, "has a gift for strategic omission." The corner of Silas Hayes's mouth moved in a way that was definitely a smile this time, brief and almost startled, like he hadn't expected to produce one. Helen noticed it again. She told herself it was simply interesting that a man she had called a coward to his face 3 days ago was now sitting across from her with a smile that softened about 10 years of something difficult, and that she had noticed this was simply a function of being an observant person. The ride out to the Mercer ranch on Friday morning, was 5 miles of flat Kansas grassland interrupted by low rolling hills and cottonwoods following the creek line. And the sky was that particular September blue that Kansas sometimes produced that was so absolute it looked painted. Silas rode a bay gelding named Cortez, and Helen rode a stout gray mare she had hired from the livery stable, and they rode side by side because the track was wide enough, and the conversation they had on that ride was the first conversation they had that was not directly about Frank Cutter or Aldous Pemberton. He asked about her work in Wichita. She told him about it in a way that was honest but not romantic about it, which meant she told him about the students she had worried about and the parents she had fought with, and the school board politics she had navigated, and the particular satisfaction of watching a child understand something they had not understood before. He listened without the half-attention that people often gave her when she talked about teaching, as if it were a lesser subject. He asked questions. Good ones. She asked about his time as a federal marshal. He told her carefully, not boastfully, about the years in the territory before Kansas was fully settled, the years of Dodge City, the years working under men who were trying to build something orderly out of something that was entirely disorderly, and what that effort cost and what it occasionally produced. Did you ever want to leave? She asked. Law enforcement. Yes, he said. After James Corey, I wrote a resignation 3 times. But you didn't send it. No. Why? He thought about it with the seriousness she was coming to expect from him, the refusal to answer quickly when the quick answer would not be true. Because a resigned man cannot finish what he started. And Pemberton would still be operating, and Cutter would still be driving families off their land, and the resignation would only benefit me. She looked at him sideways, at his profile against the blue sky. That is a demanding standard. I have a demanding conscience. So do I, she said, and there was a small quiet acknowledgment in that, a recognition of a shared quality that was neither of them expected from a stranger. At the Mercer Ranch, Clara came out of the house at a near run when she saw Helen dismounting, and the embrace they shared in the dust of the yard was the kind that contained everything a letter could not. Helen held her sister and felt the thinness of her through her dress, the way worry had worn her down, and made a promise she did not say aloud but felt with the full weight of herself. Thomas Mercer was a quiet, solid man of 30 with his father's angular jaw softened by something gentler in his expression. He shook Silas Hayes's hand with the careful dignity of a man who had come to the law for help and not fully gotten it, and Silas accepted the handshake with an acknowledgment in his expression that Helen read as, I know. I am trying to change that. Abel Mercer was in the barn when they arrived, and when he came out to meet them, he was older than Helen had imagined, not elderly but aged by something, weathered and careful in the way of a man who has learned that not all situations can be solved by hard work and patience, and that this fact should not surprise him but still somehow does. He was perhaps 60, with Thomas's jaw and a direct gray gaze that reminded Helen slightly of Silas's. They sat in the house, and Abel's wife, Martha, brought out coffee and cornbread, and Helen ate the cornbread because she was hungry and it was very good, and then she and Silas told the Mercers what they were working on. Not all of it, enough of it. Abel's face as he listened moved through several things, wariness and hope and anger and something that was almost relief, the relief of a man who had been fighting alone and has just discovered he was not, in fact, alone. I have all my tax records, he said. Everyone, filed on time every year. Helen nodded. Keep them somewhere safe, not in this house. Why not this house? Because if Cutter decides to escalate before we are ready, a fire is a convenient way to eliminate documentation. The silence that followed that statement was the kind that comes when someone says aloud the worst version of a fear that everyone in the room has already been thinking. Martha Mercer looked at her husband. Abel Mercer looked at Silas. Silas said, She is right, move the records. I have a lockbox at the Caldwell house, Helen said. I will pay for additional space. Bring them to me. Clara caught her sister's eye across the room with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and something that might have been impressed, and Helen shook her head slightly at her, a small sisterly motion that meant, "We will talk about the strategic omissions later." The letter to Topeka went out that Friday evening. Helen's contact there, a woman named Marguerite Flores who had been a fellow teacher in Lawrence in 1876 and had subsequently moved to Topeka and taken a records position with the State Land Office, received it the following Wednesday. Her reply arrived in Caldwell Creek the following Monday, 12 days after Helen had sent the letter, and it was brief and contained within it a single sentence that Helen had to read 3 times to fully understand its significance. The Voss letter, Marguerite wrote, had been received by the State Land Office and filed, and was technically a public record, and Marguerite had, as a matter of professional record-keeping, made a copy at the time of receipt, and that copy was enclosed. The copy was 4 pages in Harold Voss's careful clerk's handwriting, and it named 3 specific companies, 2 specific individuals, and 4 specific land filings that Voss had identified as potentially fraudulent. One of the companies was Frontier Holdings. One of the individuals was Frank Cutter. The other individual was a name that Helen did not recognize. She brought it to Silas Hayes within an hour of receiving it. He read it standing at his desk, and when he got to the second name, his expression did something that told Helen the name meant something significant. "Reginald Marsh," she said. "Who is Reginald Marsh?" Silas set the letter down. "He is Pemberton's lawyer and his closest business associate. He is also the man who managed the dissolution of Frontier Holdings and the establishment of Blue Rock Land Associates." He paused. "He is also, until this moment, entirely invisible in every piece of documentation I have ever gathered. Harold Voss knew about Marsh. Marsh had Voss killed." The air in the office went very still. "You believe Marsh was the one who arranged Voss's death," Helen said. "I believe Pemberton ordered it and Marsh arranged it, yes." "That changes what we are building toward." "Yes, it means this is not simply a land fraud case. It is a murder." Helen sat down in the chair across from his desk. This was the chair in which she had sat the first day, the chair in which she had slammed her hand on the desk and called him a coward, and sitting in it now felt very different. "Silas," she said, and his name was easy now, had become easy somewhere in the past 2 weeks without her noticing the exact moment it had happened. "Are we in danger?" He looked at her directly. She appreciated that he did not minimize it. "If Cutter finds out about the Voss letter, yes. If Pemberton discovers there is someone in Caldwell Creek building a case that names Marsh, yes. We need to move faster than I had planned." "What do we need?" "The Voss letter is good, but it is one document. I need something that ties Pemberton directly to Cutter's actions here, not just to the land companies. I need Cutter to do something provable in this county." "Then we make him do something," Helen said. Silas looked at her. "What do you mean?" She had been thinking about Abel Mercer and his tax records and the pattern of Cutter's previous escalations, and she had a thought that was not entirely comfortable to have because it involved using Abel Mercer as something adjacent to bait, but it was also the clearest path forward she could see. "Cutter is going to file a false claim against Mercer's land. You said that was his pattern. Instead of waiting for him to choose the timing, we make it easy for him to move now, before we are fully ready, but in a way that we are prepared for." "Explain." "Abel Mercer lets it be known through a reliable community channel that he has discovered a discrepancy in his records, something minor. Something that sounds like a vulnerability. Cutter hears it through his information network, which includes Roy Dabbs. Cutter moves quickly because he thinks the opportunity is closing. When he files the claim, you have Roy Dabbs in the position of certifying it, which gives you documented evidence of Dabbs actively falsifying a record. You arrest Dabbs. You offer him reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Cutter. Cutter, facing testimony from his own paid deputy, looks for a deal. His deal involves testimony against Marsh and Pemberton." The silence that followed was not the still silence of alarm. It was the charged silence of a man thinking very fast. "That requires Mercer to agree to it," Silas said finally. "He will agree. He is not a man who will flinch from risk when the risk has a purpose. It also requires Dabbs to take the deal. Roy Dabbs is a man who made a bad choice for money. In my experience, men who make bad choices for money are usually more interested in their own continued freedom than in loyalty to the man who paid them, particularly when the man who paid them is connected to a murder." Silas sat back. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she kept noticing and kept redirecting herself away from. "Where did you develop this kind of strategic thinking?" "10 years of school board politics," she said. He said, "I want to hear the school board stories someday." The word someday sat in the air between them, and neither of them immediately moved away from it. "Someday," she said carefully, "when this is over." He nodded. They began to plan. Abel Mercer agreed without hesitation when they rode out to the ranch that Saturday. He listened to the plan with the same direct gray gaze his son had, and when it was finished he looked at his wife, who looked back at him with the particular calm of a woman who has decided that there is only one right thing and that she has already made peace with whatever it costs. "I will say it to Everett Price at the general store on Monday," Abel said. "Price will have it to Cutter's foreman by Monday evening." "Be specific," Helen said. "Say that you found a gap in your records from 1877 and that you are not sure the filing was completed before the deadline." "Why 1877 specifically?" "Because that is the year that Kansas had significant disruption in its county record systems due to the reorganization of the county clerk's offices. A gap in 1877 would be believable and difficult to quickly disprove." "Cutter will recognize it as a plausible weakness." Abel Mercer nodded slowly. "You have done your reading." "I have done my reading," she agreed. Silas rode beside her on the way back to Caldwell Creek, and the afternoon had gone golden and slanted, and the creek caught the light in pieces through the cottonwood leaves, and they were both quiet for a time, carrying the weight of what they were setting in motion. "You are afraid," he said, not as an accusation or a surprise, just as an observation. "Yes," she said, "a little. That is sensible." "I am usually sensible." She paused. "I am also very angry. I want you to know that. The fear is real, but the anger is larger, and the anger is useful." "What are you angry about?" "I am angry that Harold Voss is dead. I am angry that James Corey had to disappear with his pregnant wife. I am angry that Abel and Martha Mercer, who have done nothing wrong and everything right, are eating cornmeal and watching their son's family suffer. I am angry that a man like Pemberton can operate for years because he is clever enough to keep his hands clean while other people do his dirty work." She paused. "I am angry that it took an opinionated schoolteacher from Wichita to come here and force the issue, because the system that should have forced it did not." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I said I had been bored for years, I was not entirely accurate." She glanced at him. Boredom was not quite the right word. The right word was closer to— He stopped and tried again. "There is a specific kind of feeling that comes when you are a person who solves things, and the thing you most need to solve is the one thing you cannot touch safely, and every day you look at it and every day you cannot move. That is not quite boredom. It is something more like being stopped." "Yes," she said quietly, "I understand that. You do not seem like a person who gets stopped." "I get stopped sometimes. When I do, I become very argumentative as a compensatory mechanism." He laughed. It was unexpected and genuine and had a warmth to it that she felt somewhere in her chest, and she made a note to herself that was less a professional note and more a personal one, and the personal note said, "You are in some danger here, Helen Hawthorne, and it is not the kind that comes from Frank Cutter." She did not do anything about that note. There was too much to do. The following week proceeded with the precision of a planned thing, which meant it also had the particular anxiety of a planned thing, the period of waiting between the setting of a trap and the moment it either springs or fails. Abel Mercer spoke to Everett Price on Monday. By Tuesday afternoon, Silas had Roy Dabbs in a casual conversation about routine matters during which Dabbs let slip, just slightly too casually, that he had heard Mercer was having some trouble with his old records. Silas came to the schoolhouse Tuesday evening with that information, and Helen said, "He heard. Good. Cutter will want to move within the week. Then we need everything in position." What they needed in position was a set of documents that would be presented to Dabbs as the false claim materials he would be asked to certify. Silas had written to a contact in Dodge City, a former colleague now practicing law, and received advice on the precise legal language required. Helen had helped draft the false claim itself, a document claiming that Mercer's 1877 filing had been incomplete and that the land had therefore reverted to territorial disposition, available for new filing. It was convincing. It was also embedded within it in two specific places, subtly irregular in ways that would be clear to a competent attorney but would not be caught by Cutter's operation before they acted. By Thursday, Cutter's lawyer, a man named Pearson, came into the county clerk's office with a claim filing. Roy Dabbs was at the clerk's counter that afternoon, as Silas had arranged through careful positioning of duty assignments. Pearson presented the filing. Dabbs looked at it. The regular county clerk, a woman named Nell Garrity who was in on the plan, stepped away at the appropriate moment to allow Dabbs to process the filing. Dabbs stamped it. He recorded it in the ledger. He filed it. Silas Hayes arrested Roy Dabbs that same Thursday evening. It was not dramatic. Silas walked into the sheriff's office where Dabbs was sitting at the deputy's desk eating his supper, and he placed both hands on the desk and told Dabbs, in a voice that had no room in it for argument, exactly what he had just watched Dabbs do and why it was a criminal offense, and that he had a choice to make right now. Dabbs looked at the wall for a long time. Then he said, "What is the deal?" The deal was exactly what Helen had predicted: reduced charges and no prison time in exchange for full documented testimony about every transaction and instruction he had received from Frank Cutter, including dates, amounts, and specific actions taken. Dabbs provided it over the following 2 days in Silas's office, and the testimony was voluminous and specific, and included 3 incidents that Silas had not known about, and one that confirmed the connection between Cutter and Marsh. Marsh had visited Caldwell Creek once in June. Dabbs had seen them together. Marsh had given Cutter a document. Dabbs had not read the document, but he had seen the exchange, and he could identify Marsh from a photograph. Silas wrote to his former superior in the United States Marshal's office in Topeka, a man named Crawford, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of break for as long as Silas had been building the case. Crawford arrived in Caldwell Creek by train on a Friday morning, 10 days after Dabbs's arrest, with 2 deputy marshals and a federal warrant. Frank Cutter was arrested at his ranch. He looked at the federal warrant and looked at Crawford's badge and looked at the 2 deputy marshals, and something in his face went through the particular collapse of a man who has been operating on the assumption that he is protected and has just discovered the protection has been withdrawn. He asked for his lawyer. Pearson arrived, read the situation, and quietly told Cutter that the charges were federal and that his best path was cooperation. It took 4 more days. 4 more days of testimony, of documentation, of cross-referencing. And then on a gray October morning, United States Deputy Marshal Crawford sat across a table from Frank Cutter and offered him a deal. Cutter gave them Reginald Marsh. Marsh was arrested in Topeka 2 weeks later. He gave them Aldous Pemberton. Pemberton was taken into federal custody on a Thursday in November, and the charges against him included land fraud, conspiracy, and in connection with Harold Voss's death, accessory to murder. Helen was in the schoolhouse when Silas came to tell her. She was erasing the blackboard again, which she did at the end of every school day, and he came to the door the way he had that first time, hat in hand, and she turned around and she could see from his face before he said a word. "It is done," he said. She set down the eraser. She had not cried once in the 6 weeks since she had arrived in Caldwell Creek. Not when Clara had told her the full extent of the situation at the Mercer Ranch. Not when she had realized Harold Voss was probably murdered. Not during the tense waiting period after the trap was set. She had been precise and angry and useful. She cried now briefly, with the unself-consciousness of someone who knows they are in a private place with a person they trust. And Silas Hayes stepped into the schoolroom and did not say anything, which was exactly the right thing. And after a moment she took the handkerchief he offered and used it, and felt the particular physical relief of having something conclude. "Abel Mercer's land is safe?" she asked. "Yes, the false claim has been voided. His title is clear. Clara and Thomas can go back to building their lives." She nodded. She handed him back the handkerchief, folded neatly, which made him smile in a way that she saw and did not redirect herself away from this time. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I have a teaching position," she said. "I am contracted through the school year." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the schoolroom windows at a slant, and the room had the quiet that came after the children had gone home, a warm, dust-and-chalk-and old primer quiet that she loved. "I am glad," he said. The word "I am glad" was carrying more weight than its 3 syllables warranted, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved away from it this time. "Silas," she said. "Yes. When I came into your office 6 weeks ago and called you a coward, you were right," he said. "Not entirely right, but partially. I was partially right and partially wrong, and I said it in a way that was more aggressive than it needed to be." "No," he said very carefully. "It needed to be that aggressive. I had made peace with a situation that did not deserve peace. I needed someone to refuse to make peace with it." She looked at him for a moment. "I am not going to apologize for arguing. I am not asking you to. I am going to continue to argue about things quite frequently." "Yes," he said, and there was something in his voice that was warm and decided and wholly intentional. "I know. You said you had been bored for years. I said that. Are you still bored?" He held her gaze steadily. "No," he said. "I have not been bored for a single moment of the last 6 weeks." Helen Hawthorne, who had made a note to herself 3 weeks ago about the particular danger of a man who could make her feel something in her chest when he laughed, looked at Silas Hayes in the October afternoon light and decided that the note had been accurate, and that being accurate was, in her experience, usually better than being cautious. "Then perhaps," she said, "you would like to take supper with me this evening." He said yes. He said it in the quiet, direct way he said things he had already decided, and the simplicity of it was one of the best things she had ever heard. They took supper at the Caldwell House dining room, which was not a grand establishment but served a decent beefsteak and kept its coffee hot, and they talked for 3 hours while the other diners came and went around them. They talked about things that were not Frank Cutter or Aldous Pemberton or water rights, and those conversations were just as interesting as the ones that had been, which said something important. He told her about his family, a mother who had died when he was 12, a father who had been a surveyor and had taken him all over the Eastern Territories as a boy, an older brother who had settled in Missouri and whom he visited when he could and wished he could more. He told her about the years before he had taken the marshal's position, when he had spent a winter in the Flint Hills simply being in the territory without any particular purpose, and how that had clarified things for him in ways that had shaped everything afterward. She told him about her family, her mother and father, who had come west from Ohio in 1852, and had raised their 2 daughters with a firm conviction that women's education was not supplementary but foundational. Her father had died in 1878, and she still carried that loss with a clean, honest weight. Her mother lived in Wichita and had strong opinions about most things, which was, Helen acknowledged, a trait she had inherited without modification. He asked her when she had decided to be a teacher. She told him about a teacher in Lawrence who had been the first adult outside her family who had looked at the particular way her mind worked and said not this is unusual but this is useful, and how that distinction had changed her understanding of herself. He listened with the full attention he gave to everything, and she found, as she had found in the weeks of working alongside him, that being listened to by Silas Hayes was a particular experience, the experience of being taken entirely seriously, every word, every nuance, every gap between words. She walked back to the hotel that evening with the October night crisp and full of stars, and he walked beside her because the town was quiet but not entirely quiet, and he was, she had learned, someone for whom the habit of watchfulness was so deeply ingrained that he did it without thinking. At the hotel door he said, "Helen." She waited. "I would like to call on you formally," he said. "If that is something you would consider." She thought about it for a moment with the genuine internal consideration she gave things she cared about, not performing deliberation but actually deliberating. "I would consider it," she said, "with the understanding that I will continue to argue about things, including things that you have decided, and that this is not a negotiable characteristic." "I know," he said, and his voice was absolutely certain about this in a way that made her understand he was not tolerating it but genuinely, specifically glad of it. "Then yes," she said, "call on me." He called on her the following Sunday afternoon, and the Sunday after that, and by the third Sunday they were walking along the creek path east of town in a way that required no particular pretense of occasion. By November they had attended a community social together that resulted in a considerable amount of speculation in Caldwell Creek, which was a small enough town that any significant change in the social arrangements of the sheriff was of general interest. By December they had reached an ease with each other that was particular and irreplaceable, the ease of two people who had gone through something difficult together and come out of it knowing each other at a level that takes most people years to reach. He kissed her for the first time at the end of December, on an evening when the temperature had dropped hard, and the stars over the Kansas plains were bright and cold and very close, and they were standing on the porch of the hotel after he had walked her back from the Mercer Ranch, where they had spent Christmas Day with Clara and Thomas and Abel and Martha. It was a quiet kiss, not tentative but careful, the kiss of a man who has thought about something long enough to be sure of it. She kissed him back with a directness that he would later tell her had surprised him, and she had said, "Why would I be indirect about something I want?" And he had said, "I have no idea why I thought you might be," and they had both laughed. In January she received a letter from the school board in Wichita offering her a position they considered a significant promotion. She read it at the school desk, and then she set it down and looked at the window for a while. She did not go to Silas about it. She thought about it herself for 3 days, which was how she made decisions, by taking them apart and looking at the pieces separately, and the pieces were. She had built something real here, both in the school, where 3 of her students had made progress in the past 3 months that surprised and moved her, and in the town, where she was known and where she had done something that mattered. And there was Silas, who was specific and irreplaceable and present, and the distance between Caldwell Creek and Wichita was a day's train ride, which was too far for what was developing between them to sustain itself at the current pace, and the current pace was exactly right. On the 4th day she wrote back to the school board in Wichita and declined. She told Silas that evening, and he went quiet in the way he went quiet when something affected him and he was deciding how to speak about it. "You did not tell me before you decided," he said. "No." "Why?" "Because the decision was mine," she said, "not because I did not want your opinion. Because if I told you before deciding, your opinion would be about what you wanted, and what I needed to do was decide based on what I wanted." He thought about that. "And what you wanted was to stay." "What I wanted was to stay," she confirmed. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, carefully and directly, in the way he said things he had been considering for some time, "Helen, I love you. I have been working toward a way to say that in a manner that would not alarm you, given that we have known each other for approximately 4 months, and I have been unable to arrive at a diplomatic version, so I am saying it plainly." She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when something was real and she was receiving it fully. "I love you too," she said. "I have known it since approximately the third week, which I consider an embarrassingly short timeline given my general preference for deliberation, but there it is." He crossed the room and took her hand, and she looked up at him, and they were both, for a moment, simply present with the fact of it, the plain good fact of two difficult and particular people who had, against the odds of their own natures, found each other completely. He asked her to marry him in February, on the afternoon of Valentine's Day, in the schoolroom after the children had gone, because she had been in the schoolroom when so many of the important things in this story had happened, and it seemed right. He did not have a ring yet. He had the ring back at the office, and he would give it to her when they got there, but he could not wait until they got there. She said yes without deliberating. He noted this with great tenderness. The ring was a simple gold band with a small garnet, which he had ordered from a jeweler in Dodge City, and it fit her finger as if it had been made for her, which he said, and she said, "You had my hand measured," and he said, "I held your hand and paid attention," and she said, "That is the most like you thing you have ever said," and he said, "I will take that as the compliment I believe it to be." They were married in April, in the small white church at the south end of Main Street, on a Saturday when the prairie around Caldwell Creek was coming into the particular green of Kansas spring, and the sky was doing something that looked deliberately ceremonial. Clara stood with Helen, and Thomas stood with Silas, and Abel Mercer sat in the front pew with Martha, and watched the ceremony with the expression of a man who has seen something come right after a long time of wrongness. George Aldridge, the old cattle rancher from the town council who had been bitterly furious about his neighbor's situation and unable to help, was also there, and when the ceremony was done, he shook Silas's hand and kissed Helen's cheek and told her, gruffly and with a slightly wet quality to his voice that he would have objected to being noticed, that she was the best thing that had happened to this town in 10 years, and that he was glad she came. Helen thanked him genuinely, and did not mention the wet quality of his voice, because she was considerate in this way even while being argumentative in others. The first year of their marriage was the year Helen finished building the school program she had started to envision, adding a second reader level, and pushing for a modest expansion of the schoolhouse building that the town council initially resisted and eventually approved, after 3 meetings in which Helen argued with the precision and persistence of someone who had once dismantled a land speculation network, and therefore found school board politics relatively low stakes. Silas watched the third of these meetings from the back of the room, with the expression she had come to know best on him, the one that was fond and alert and quietly enjoying itself. When it was over and the council had voted 3-1 to approve the expansion, she walked to the back of the room and he said, "You were magnificent," and she said, "I was correct, which is all that matters," and he said, "You are always correct," and she said, "That is generous but not entirely accurate," and he said, "It is accurate enough for practical purposes." In the second year of their marriage, Clara and Thomas had their second child, a boy they named Abel Jr., who joined his older sister Josephine in a household that had become considerably less strained since the previous year's events. Abel Sr. had expanded his cattle operation back to its pre-cutter scale and was cautiously optimistic about the following year's market. The federal case against Aldous Pemberton concluded in the spring of that second year. He was convicted on 7 counts including fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder in the second degree in connection with Harold Voss's death. Reginald Marsh was convicted on similar charges. Frank Cutter, in exchange for his substantial cooperation, received a reduced sentence of 7 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. Helen received the news of Pemberton's conviction in a letter from Marshall Crawford in Topeka, and she read it at the kitchen table of the house she and Silas shared on Elm Street, a solid 2-story clapboard house with a good porch and a kitchen garden that she was learning, with more difficulty than she had anticipated, to maintain. She read the letter and thought about Harold Voss, who had seen something wrong and written a letter about it and been killed for being correct. She thought about that for a while, sitting at the table with the letter in her hands, and then she got up and went out to the porch where Silas was sitting with his morning coffee. Pemberton was convicted, she said. He took the letter, he read it, he set it on the porch railing. Good, he said simply. Harold Voss deserved better, she said. Yes, he said, he did. He paused. We could write to his widow, not about the case, just to say that someone remembered what he tried to do. Helen looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said, let us do that. They wrote it together that afternoon, a letter that was not about justice or vindication or legal outcomes, but was simply about the fact that Harold Voss had been a man who had tried to do the right thing, and that people who had benefited from that attempt were grateful. In the summer of their second year, Helen discovered she was expecting a child. She told Silas on a July evening, sitting on the porch while the heat of the day was fading and the fireflies were starting in the grass along the yard's edge. She told him directly, which was how she told things. He was quiet for a moment, and then he did something she had not seen him do before, which was that he set down his coffee cup and put his head in his hands for just a second, not from distress but from the particular overwhelm of something completely good, and then he looked up and he was not even trying to compose his expression, which she treasured. "Are you well?" he asked. "Entirely well," she said. "Somewhat nauseous in the mornings, but otherwise entirely well." "Helen." "Yes, I need a moment. Take all the time you need." He took approximately 30 seconds, and then he took her hand and held it with both of his, and looked at her with everything he had never been able to say as compactly as this. All the years of the stopped feeling, all the cost of the careful work, all the particular loneliness of being a thorough and serious person in a world that was often neither. And the fact that this woman had walked into his life and refused to let him be stopped and had argued with him about everything and had loved him precisely as he was and was now sitting on his porch carrying the continuation of all of it. "I am going to be a terrible worrier," he said. "You are going to be a wonderful father," she said. "The worrying is part of it." Their son was born in February of the third year, in the house on Elm Street, attended by the town doctor and Martha Mercer, who had considerable experience in these matters, and who managed the whole proceeding with a calm authority that Helen found deeply reassuring. The labor was difficult at the beginning and manageable by the end, and the baby announced himself at 4 in the morning, with a thoroughness that suggested he had his mother's feelings about being noticed. They named him William, for no particular reason except that they both liked it, and William Hayes had his father's gray eyes and his mother's refusal to be managed, which was apparent within approximately 48 hours of his arrival. Silas held his son for the first time in the early morning light of that February, standing at the window of their bedroom, while Helen slept the particular heavy sleep of the newly recovered, and he looked at the small, clenched face of William Hayes and felt something that he had no vocabulary for and did not need one. He had spent years in a kind of stopped state, watching a situation he could not address, carrying the weight of James Corey's disappearance and Harold Voss's death, and the boredom that was not really boredom. And a woman had walked into his office and slammed her hand on his desk and called him a coward and changed everything. And the change had not been simply the arrest of Cutter and Pemberton, though that was real and good and lasting. The change was this: the complete, startling, irreversible restoration of the belief that things could be fixed, that the stopped feeling was not permanent, that someone could arrive who argued about everything, and that this would turn out to be exactly what you needed. Helen recovered quickly and thoroughly because she was that kind of person, and within 2 weeks was sitting up in bed with William on one arm and a book on her other knee, which Silas observed with the particular fond exasperation of a man who has tried and failed to convince his wife to rest. "You should sleep," he said. "William is awake," she said. "I will take him. He is nursing. After he falls asleep, I will sleep. You said that an hour ago. He keeps waking up. Because you keep reading to him and he finds it interesting. She looked up at him over the baby's head. He does find it interesting. He is 11 days old. He is 11 days old and his mother is reading to him and he is listening. This is excellent. I will sleep when he sleeps. Silas sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son in the lamplight and decided not to argue about it, which was not because he had given up, but because there were moments when winning an argument was simply less valuable than being in the room. In the spring of William's first year, Silas received an offer from the federal marshal's office in Topeka. The offer was a significant position, the kind of advancement that 4 years earlier he would have considered without hesitation. He came home with the letter and sat at the kitchen table and read it twice, and then he left it there and went out to the garden where Helen was fighting with the tomato plants, which was a seasonal battle she was determined to win, and the tomatoes were not cooperating. She read his face when he came out. She always read his face. "What happened?" she said. He told her about the offer. She stood up from the tomato plants and dusted off her hands, and he watched her think about it, which she did quickly when she had all the information she needed. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to know what you think. I think it is a significant offer and you deserve it, and Topeka is not the end of the world. But what do you want?" He looked at the yard, at the house, at the school at the end of the street where the children were just beginning to arrive for the morning, at his wife in her garden with a streak of Kansas earth on her forearm. "I want this," he said. "I have built this. We have built this. I do not want to start over in Topeka." Helen nodded, then write and decline. "It is a significant opportunity. I know. Do you want it?" "No." "Then decline," she said, and turned back to the tomato plants with the decisiveness of someone who has no interest in making simple things complicated. "Do it today so you do not spend the week second-guessing." He wrote the letter that afternoon and felt, after he sent it, the particular lightness of a right decision, the kind that is right not because it leads to the most impressive outcome, but because it is the truest one. The school celebrated its new addition in the fall of William's second year. 2 new rooms, a proper library space with a modest collection of books that Helen had assembled through a combination of town fundraising, personal expenditure, and an extremely persuasive letter-writing campaign that had resulted in donations from 3 institutions in Wichita, a literary society in Topeka, and one completely unexpected donation from a retired judge in Lawrence who said he had read her letter twice and admired its construction. The school now served 22 students. Helen had hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Dora Whitfield, who had been teaching herself from primers since she was 12, and who had the natural instinct for the work that Helen recognized immediately and cultivated without condescension. At the dedication of the new rooms, George Aldridge, who had become a genuine friend over the years and who attended most things of community significance mostly, Helen suspected, because his wife had died the previous winter and he did not like being at home alone, made a speech that was shorter than he had threatened and funnier than anyone expected, and then he shook Helen's hand and said, "Harold Voss would have liked you." She was startled. "You knew Harold Voss?" "We were in the same land commissioners' meeting in 1880. Good man, careful thinker. He saw things straight." He paused. "You see things straight too." Helen was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Thank you, George," and meant it in a way that was larger than the words. In the year that William turned 3, Clara and Thomas had their 3rd child, a boy they named Silas, which made the actual Silas Hayes clear his throat and look at the middle distance in a way that William, sitting on his mother's lap, found interesting enough to point at. "Papa is making the throat sound," William observed. "Papa is touched," Helen explained. "What is touched?" "It means something made him feel something important." William considered this. He was a precise child, which surprised no one, with a strong desire to understand the taxonomy of things. "Is it like when he reads me the story about the bear and his eyes do the thing?" Helen looked at her husband's face. "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." The following spring brought news from James Corey, Silas's former deputy who had disappeared the year before Helen arrived. He sent a letter from Omaha, Nebraska, where he had settled with his wife after the year of enforced hiding. He had a daughter, he wrote, who was 3 years old and had just said her first full sentence. He had been following the news of the Pemberton case from a distance and had waited until the convictions were final and confirmed before believing he could safely make contact. He was sorry for the long silence. He thought of Silas often and hoped he had built a good life. Silas sat with that letter for a long time. Helen found him at the kitchen table with it in his hand, and she sat down across from him and waited. "He is safe," Silas said finally. "I know. That is the best part of the letter. I thought about him for 3 years. I know. I thought I had failed him. You protected him," she said, "by building the case carefully. If you had rushed, Pemberton's lawyers would have destroyed it and Cutter would still be operating, and James Corey would never have been safe to come back." He looked at her. "You did not fail," she said. "You were thorough, and thoroughness felt like paralysis from the inside, but the result was right. James Corey has a daughter and she is 3 years old and she just said her first full sentence." He set the letter down and reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it for a while in the morning kitchen of their house on Elm Street. And through the window they could hear William in the yard talking to himself with great seriousness about something that involved sticks. Silas wrote back to James Corey that same day, a long letter that took the full afternoon and went through 3 drafts before Helen was summoned to help him articulate the part that was hardest, which was the part that said, "I am glad you are whole and I am glad it is over, and I want you to know that the case was built, and the men are in prison, and the land they tried to steal is back in the hands of the people it belongs to." The letter was sent. It arrived. James Corey wrote back, and the letters continued, and Silas and James Corey, who had been sheriff and deputy once and had had that severed by something neither of them had caused, rebuilt something over the years in correspondence. A friendship maintained across distance, honest and regular and carrying within it the kind of mutual knowledge that comes from having been through something real. Helen taught for another 5 years at the Caldwell Creek School before the district grew large enough to require a full superintendent, and she was offered the role by the school board with a nervousness on their part that she found touching, given that 2 of them had initially been uncertain about hiring her at all. She accepted. She appointed Dora Whitfield as head teacher. She expanded the curriculum. She started a lending library program that sent books to 3 smaller communities within the county that had no school of their own. She fought with the county board about funding so regularly that the board chairman, a placid man named Mr. Hurst, developed a visible though not unfriendly tension in his expression whenever he saw her approaching from down the street. Silas remained sheriff of Caldwell Creek. He was reelected twice with margins that said something about the town's feeling on the matter. He trained 2 successive deputies with a thoroughness that owed something to James Corey, and to the lesson he had learned about what happens when you protect a good person badly. He was known as a fair and unhurried man with an absolute quality that made people feel, when they brought a problem to his office, that the problem would be taken seriously and that something would actually be done. He was still, occasionally, bored. But it was the ordinary boredom of ordinary days, not the stopped boredom of a man looking at an unsolvable problem. And at the end of ordinary bored days, he came home to his wife and his son, and an argument about something. Usually something he was wrong about, sometimes something she was wrong about, and the argument was always interesting and always arrived somewhere real, and always ended in the particular warmth of 2 people who argue well because they pay full attention to each other. William Hayes grew up straight and curious with a talent for mathematics that his father was better positioned to appreciate than to explain, and a talent for reading people that his mother recognized as her own trait, though she told him it was its own thing and he should develop it in his own direction. He was a gentle boy with a stubborn streak, and a sense of humor that emerged slowly, and when it did, was dry and precise and hit exactly what it aimed at. In the spring when William was 7, Helen told Silas she was expecting again. He was standing at the kitchen stove when she told him, making coffee, and he turned around with the coffee pot still in his hand and looked at her with the same unguarded expression he had worn when William was announced, the one that was everything at once. "You are smiling," she said. "I am aware. You are smiling while holding the coffee pot." He set down the coffee pot. "Are you well?" "Entirely well, slightly nauseated in the mornings. Familiar situation." He crossed the kitchen and put both arms around her, and she leaned into him, which was something she did when she was tired or when something was very good, and the morning light was coming in at the window, and outside William was already in the yard, already talking to something, a dog they had acquired the previous year, a yellow dog named Charlemagne who had chosen their yard and declined to leave. "William will be pleased," she said. "William will be extremely opinionated about the naming." "Yes. He has been preparing a list for approximately 2 months." Silas pulled back enough to look at her. "He has a list. He told me at dinner last Tuesday that if we ever had another child he had some thoughts. I asked what prompted the thought, and he said he had been looking at the Mercer children and noticing things." "What things?" "He is 7, she said. He noticed that having a sibling means you always have someone to talk to." Silas was quiet for a moment. His son had the most economical way of arriving at true things. "What names are on the list?" "I do not know. He said he would present them at the appropriate time." The appropriate time, by William's reckoning, was that same evening at supper, when he produced a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and unfolded it with great deliberateness, and announced that he had 4 names for a boy and 3 for a girl, and would they like to hear them? They would. The list for a boy was Daniel, Thomas after his uncle, George after old George Aldridge who came to dinner sometimes and told good stories, and Robert. The list for a girl was Margaret after their mother's mother, Clara after his aunt, and Pearl, because William had read about pearls in one of his mother's books and thought it was a good word. Helen and Silas looked at each other over their son's head. "Those are excellent names," Helen said. "I thought carefully," William said. "We can tell," Silas said. "Will you use one of them?" "We will think about it very seriously," Helen said. "That usually means maybe," William said. "It means seriously maybe," Silas said. The second child was a girl, born in October, and her name was Margaret after her mother's mother, which William received as a settlement with the dignity of a young person who has negotiated well enough. Margaret Hayes announced herself with the same thoroughness as her brother had, and then, after the initial announcement, quieted into a watchful attentiveness that made Helen look at Silas and say, "She is going to be like you," and Silas said, "God help us," and Helen said, "What is wrong with being like you?" and Silas said, "Nothing, I just know what it is like to observe for 3 years before moving," and Helen said, "She will do it in 2 years maximum with my influence," and he laughed. The years that followed had the texture of a good life, which is not the texture of ease but of meaning, of work that mattered and love that was steady and arguments that arrived somewhere real. Helen argued with school boards and county officials, and occasionally with Silas, who had become, over the years, genuinely formidable in argument himself, partially through the experience of arguing with her regularly and partially because he had always been careful and thorough, and he had simply, under her influence, stopped being quiet about it. She had told him once that the most useful thing she had done in Caldwell Creek was refuse to let him be still, and he had said, "No, the most useful thing you did was know more about property law than anyone in this town when you arrived and use it before anyone knew you had it," and she had said, "Those were the same action," and he had conceded the point. Clara visited twice a year with Thomas and the children, and those visits had the noise and warmth of family, of children running through the house, and Clara and Helen sitting in the kitchen with coffee, while their husbands sat on the porch and managed not to talk about Frank Cutter at all, which had taken several years to achieve and was now entirely natural. Abel Mercer's cattle operation grew. Martha Mercer taught Helen to make a proper cornbread, which Helen practiced until she could do it well, which took longer than she admitted. George Aldridge came to dinner every few weeks until he died peacefully in his sleep, in the winter when William was 10, and they missed him with the particular honest grief of people who have lost someone who was actually present, who paid attention, who was there. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, Silas and Helen sat on the porch of the house on Elm Street after the children were asleep, and the April night had the quality that spring in Kansas sometimes had, warm and alive and full of things beginning, and they sat without talking for a while, which they could do, which was itself a thing it had taken time and trust to build. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she agreed. When you walked into my office, he said, and told me you argued about everything, you said you had been bored for years. I had been bored for years. Are you bored now? He looked at her, this woman who had arrived in his town with a carpetbag and a legal pad, and had dismantled a land fraud operation, and called him a coward, and married him, and given him 2 children, and argued with him about everything, and been right most of the time, and wrong occasionally, and interesting always. He looked at her in the spring dark, and the expression on his face was the same one she had first noticed in the schoolroom in October, the one that was fond and alert and quietly enjoying itself. Not for a single day, he said. She took his hand. He held it. Fireflies were starting in the grass at the yard's edge, the first ones of the season, small uncertain lights appearing and disappearing, and the school at the end of the street was dark at this hour, full of the day's work waiting for tomorrow's children, and the house behind them held William, who had fallen asleep with a book open on his face, and Margaret, who slept the watchful, attentive sleep of a child who was gathering information. Helen leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat on the porch of their house in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1892, in the comfortable living proof that boredom was not a permanent condition, that stopped things could be unstuck, that an opinionated woman and a careful man could argue their way to the clearest, most honest, most irreplaceable love of their lives. And that was exactly where they stayed.